Autumn 1989. Thousands of people sighted UFOs over Belgium. Interceptors scrambled, but were unsuccessful. Some of the objects were picked up on radar, but the phenomenon, this is an original photo, remains a mystery. The Belgian Air Force believed the sightings were genuine. At a press conference, General de Brover reported them matter-of-factly, without attempting to play them down, as the US Air Force usually does. He showed a video of an F-16's radar screen and the flight path over Belgium of one of the objects.
Kan het misschien een geval zijn van collectieve zinsbegoocheling, zoals ons wordt gesuggereerd?
Dat geloof ik niet. Dat wordt niet geregistreerd op een radarscherm en dat wordt niet geregistreerd op een cassette.
Goed, dus het is geen vliegtuig, geen laserstraal en zo verder. Wat is het dan wel?
Wij weten het niet.
Die Reaktion in Belgien darauf, man könnte natürlich erwarten, da der NATO-Sitz da ist, der Europarat da ist, da fängt man an, sich Fragen zu stellen. So ist das nicht. Wir waren beim belgischen Innenministerium damals und da hat man gefragt, das stellt doch keine Gefahr für die Bevölkerung dar. Nein, das ist nicht das Problem. Ja, dann war das für sie geregelt.
Well, what was flying over Belgium very conspicuously right at the end of the Cold War? These days, only ufologists seem interested in this question, and they are thought to be eccentric, crazy, or ridiculous, an impression resulting from decades of work by the United States military and US intelligence agencies. That's why many people at this conference didn't want to be filmed. The scientists attending were especially cautious. Only those who no longer wanted a career in science were willing to speak on camera.
Man darf nicht sagen, dass man sich damit beschäftigt. Das ist von der Gesellschaft tabuisiert. Nicht, weil die Wahrheit über diese Spinner siegt, sondern die Öffentlichkeit ist nicht informiert, hat aber ein Urteil.
Und das ist wirklich eine riesige Gefahr, weil das Grundprinzip einer Demokratie darin besteht, dass die Bevölkerung, viele Menschen, die unabhängig voneinander überlegen, kontrollieren, ob die Machtausführung richtig ist oder nicht. Das ist im Grunde das beste Prinzip, wenn es funktioniert. Aber dafür muss man auch informiert sein, sonst kann man natürlich nicht etwas beurteilen. Und das wird verhindert. Und das ist eine Entwicklung, die perniciös ist. Und das UFO-Phänomen ist ein Beispiel, um das zu illustrieren.
Something that people need to understand is that the UFO phenomenon is not simply some abstract scientific problem. It is a problem of the most important national security interest.
In the beginning was the atomic bomb. In the 1940s, only the Americans had it. Keeping the nuclear secret, guaranteed US supremacy.
This was the fiery birth of the atomic bomb, culmination of centuries of step-by-step advance in the scientific quest, achievement of intense international effort by the Democratic Allies, product of unremitting research and toil since 1939, this instant of fury and flame and of violence beyond conception sounded the end of an age and heralded a new era in the destiny of mankind, a new relationship of man to his universe.
Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the US Department of Energy's test lab and a key center of the US atomic energy program. The Army, Navy, and Air Force had their own facilities, many of them crowded together in the New Mexico desert. Above these closely guarded facilities, unknown flying objects were sighted from 1947 onward. They were not yet called UFOs. The military and the FBI began secret investigations.
In 1947, you couldn't just fly over Oak Ridge, and yet something did. Now, that's kind of important. I don't know what that was, but if I were in charge of security at Oak Ridge, I would certainly want to know what that was. And guess what? Officials at the Atomic Energy Commission and throughout the U.S. military did want to know. And there were repeated violations of airspace over many of these installations.
It was a period of high activity with strange vehicles in the sky.
Bill Gibson filmed top-secret tests conducted by various branches of the armed forces at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. They wanted to combine two high-tech weapons, the rocket and the H-bomb. Military cameramen like him filmed these tests for the scientists.
We photographed everything from V-2s to air-to-air missiles, all types of missiles.
Were these tests being spied on? The civilian and military test staff kept reporting flying discs or green spheres of light violating the test airspace.
They were complaining that there were certain objects flying around their facility, and they wanted to know what it was all about.
Some of the sightings were by top engineers, by pilots, by photographers.
Ranchers, cowboys, household people, and they would tell the stories of these little flying objects were outside the door.
There is a document, for instance, in September of 1947 from American Air Force General Nathan Twining, a four-star general, who described these objects as real, not visionary or fictitious, and not only that, but described them in great detail as metallic, disc-shaped, not leaving vapor trail, silent, indicating evasive maneuvers upon sighting, domed top, flat bottom, incredible detail.
At the test sites, people were becoming uneasy. The Army, Navy, and Air Force were fighting for nuclear supremacy within the military. They deeply distrusted one another. Wild accusations began to fly.
They accused the Air Force at Holloman Air Force Base of flying objects over their particular area. And they also accused White Sands Missile Range of flying things over their particular area.
It soon became clear that the UFOs were not some secret project of a rival service. But then, who was flying over the test area?
Captain McGovern had a system where we had an airplane sitting at the runway waiting 24 hours a day in case an unidentified object was spotted.
A converted B-25 bomber, full of movie and still cameras, chased the UFOs without success. The World War II vintage bomber was too slow for the mysterious objects. This became an annoying routine, but then, by chance, cameramen finally got a UFO in their lenses during a V-2 missile test with Werner von Braun.
One of the Ascanias got on a strange object in the sky, got on a second one, and it, from what I understand, disappeared at hundreds of miles an hour in a second.
The Air Force had been waiting for this for a long time. The undeveloped film was confiscated at once.
The film was picked up by a pilot, fighter pilot, and taken off. And from what we tried to check where he was going, and there was no flight plan.
If we got anything on film, it went directly to the Air Force. We never seen it.
Over time, Gibson filmed over 50 interviews with UFO eyewitnesses.
One of the people was a sheep herder, spoke absolutely not a word of English, but drew a picture of what he saw, this unidentified object, and it actually matched the one that they had at White Sands.
Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, headquarters of the U.S. Air Force. All the results of the UFO investigations were collected here, but the film and interviews from those days no longer exist.
The explanation that I got was that this type of information was destroyed because they needed the space, the file space. You can take that for whatever you want. There's some validity to that, and if they had shown that they didn't believe it was a problem for them, I can see them throwing the material out or destroying it. Whether they did, I don't know.
It is amazing which footage the US Air Force apparently destroyed and which it kept for eternity. Under the entry UFO in the National Archives are these images. Some are of interest to bird lovers, but otherwise they are unremarkable. They show planes, condensation trails, and other junk. A suspicious mind might wonder why.
This problem is like a 5,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, of which more than 3,000 pieces have been removed. A few fake pieces have been put in, and we have to put this thing together to figure it out.
Publicly, the military and the intelligence agencies were playing down UFOs, but internally, they were taking them seriously. Alan Dulles, director of the CIA, said, "The best way to keep a secret is to pretend to share it." The problem of the flying discs was classified top secret.
As the sightings increased, CIA officers became more concerned that there might be actually something behind it. And you can kind of understand it if you understand the mindset of the Cold War and first the Truman administration and the Eisenhower administration, that the Soviets may indeed launch a surprise attack.
So the Americans suspected that the Soviets might be behind the UFOs. Did the communists develop flying discs, possibly with the help of German scientists? They did try, but they didn't get very far. The US and the British had suspected the Soviet Union of building UFOs for some time, ever since mysterious events in Sweden the year after the war. Was this the same Soviet secret weapon?
The ghost rockets hit Sweden hard in spring 1946, and they peaked in the middle of summer 1946 and started to attract the attention of the military. And when the military got interested in the ghost rockets, it started to pour in reports of cigar-shaped objects without wings or with very small wings, many of them crashing down into lakes all around Sweden and in Finland and in Norway as well.
What were then called ghost rockets are now called UFOs. Many sightings turned out to be meteors. The only alleged photo of one actually shows a meteor.
The interesting cases are the ones where military pilots have seen them in the air. It happened on August 14th over the middle of Sweden, that the pilot and his navigator suddenly saw an object like a cigar coming from the left, moving in front of their aircraft, and they were trying to chase it. They turned their aircraft and they tried to make a pursuit, but they were outflown by this object. They didn't catch up with it.
Secret missiles that outflew Swedish planes. That made the Swedish military uneasy. And not just the Swedish military. The ghost rockets were taken very seriously and were in the headlines for weeks, even in the United States. A map that was then secret. Every dot represents a sighting, and the small flags on the dots the direction of flight. It was expected that the flags would all point east, towards the Soviet Union. But this wasn't so. Nevertheless, the Swedes had spy planes patrol the Soviet coast.
They didn't find any ramps, they didn't find any ghost rockets, they didn't find anything but the rockets still continued to fly over Sweden for many months.
In a single day, flying objects fell into lakes in 4 separate locations.
Another object came down in the middle of a lake called Kölmjärv. It's a village with 600 people at that time, and I think everyone must have heard the tremendous sound from this object coming down. The window panes were shattered, and it went down in the middle of the lake.
The Swedish army began a large-scale investigation. In those days, the army had no divers, but it took 30,000 samples of soil and used sounding rods to try and locate any wreck. It found a rectangular indentation at the bottom of one lake. That was all.
They could not find any single trace in any lake of those elusive rockets. They didn't really know why someone should shoot missiles at Swedish lakes. They were puzzled.
The neutral Swedes sought and obtained support from abroad.
The British set up a committee to investigate this phenomenon as well as the CIA was doing. So there is certainly an interest and a concern here.
Sweden had a lot of interesting guests during those weeks. David Sarnoff, founder of NBC and an expert in radio, wartime fighter ace Douglas Bader, and former US General Jimmy Doolittle, visiting officially as a vice president of Shell. During the war, he had investigated pilots' reports of spheres of light apparently following US bombers over Germany and Japan. Was Doolittle once again investigating UFOs?
He was involved in intelligence activities. I mean, he did a report for the Eisenhower administration in 1954 on the organization of the CIA and its effectiveness.
Every person ahead of a government organization, if they ran into a big problem, they called Jimmy Doolittle. And that was not just on flying, but all types of technical problems.
Washington was convinced that the Soviets were behind the ghost rockets, and US newspapers thought it was non-believers in UFOs who were ridiculous. Maybe they have been seen by sober citizens over a vast area of the United States, but Europe won't believe in them until somebody has a photograph by Frank Sinatra, the British ambassador, and 5 Supreme Court justices. Alaska, one of the hottest spots in the Cold War. Here, the superpowers eyed each other at close range. If the Soviets did launch an attack by air, they would do it by the shortest route, over the North Pole. The Army claimed that most UFOs were coming over the North Pole. The CIA suspected that the UFO false alarms were intended to clog the US early warning system and bring air defense to a standstill. It seemed the constant, pointless deployment of UFOs was intended to wear down the US interceptors to put them off when the real attack came. Or was it intended to unleash UFO hysteria, to sow panic in the population and the military? Something similar had happened in 1938. Orson Welles' radio version of The War of the Worlds about a fictitious Martian invasion of Earth caused genuine mass panic at Halloween.
Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from that mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Oh, Lord, they're turning into flames. Oh, the whole field's caught up by the woods of barns. The gas tanks of the automobiles spreading everywhere.
It was a lesson in the mass media's power to create an illusion of reality, an episode that shocked the world.
The American policymakers grew up in that period, so they were familiar with it. So they would see that as a possibility of the Soviets using psychological warfare to disrupt and panic the American people, especially in a surprise attack on the United States. I think it played into their psychological background. I don't think there's any doubt of that.
The darkest conspiracy theorists in those days were in the US intelligence agencies. They reasoned that if the Soviets were behind the UFOs, then they were behind the UFO believers, however harmless and confused they might seem.
We are your friends. Please contact us.
Were the UFO hobby groups now forming, really made up of communists? Were the UFOs part of a conspiracy, a particularly sophisticated Soviet attempt to infiltrate the United States and take it over? In fact, there were no communists among the leaders of the UFO groups, nor were there any Soviet soldiers. However, there were plenty of CIA informers. The FBI began monitoring suspected subversives. In the event of war, 200,000 people were to be immediately arrested and interned. Anyone interested in UFOs was also under suspicion. 1952. With increasing numbers of UFO reports from all over the country, the military was growing nervous.
If you were to walk into Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in July of 1952, you would have thought an invasion was underway.
And then the ultimate close encounter. UFOs were sighted over the White House, 2 weekends in a row. Washington National Airport, the 26th of July, 1952. Pilot S.C. Casey Pearman, who had just taken off, asked the air traffic controllers if they could see what he could see. Howard Cochran was in the tower at the time. He is now 85.
The object was flat on the bottom, curved on top, with lights around the outside, and smaller than the airplane.
The object was also detected on the radar screen. All the air traffic controllers on duty that night observed the UFO circling the airport.
It went around and around several times. It stopped out here and went up and then back down several times. And then it went up and disappeared out to the west.
The Air Force also observed UFOs on several occasions at different radar stations on 2 weekends. Jets were scrambled from Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, without result. A jet would chase a UFO, but failed to get within firing range. Was Washington in danger?
This was a very serious thing. The sightings themselves were not necessarily any more extraordinary than any number of other military sightings that had taken place, but they happened to be over the White House.
It caused, to say the very least, it caused major concerns in the White House and President Truman. It caused major concern within the CIA when Beadle Smith, who was the DCI, thought that we had to investigate this.
These UFOs were front-page news. It even leaked out that the Air Force was trying unsuccessfully to shoot the UFOs down. Washington had to respond or run the risk of mass hysteria. The Air Force organized the largest press conference held in the United States since the end of the war.
The official explanation was what caused these sightings was a weather phenomena known as temperature inversion, in which a layer of cool air was between layers of warm air and reflected radar in a way that confused the radar personnel.
I explained that what we had seen was not, couldn't have been temperature inversion because it went from one position to another very quickly. We tracked the object on the radar, and we calculated that the speed was around 1,000 miles an hour.
The problem was that the radar personnel were very familiar with what temperature inversion was. And all of them said, no, this was not temperature inversion. These were hard, solid targets. But they, of course, were not invited to speak at the press conference.
The Air Force Director of Intelligence, Major General John A. Sanford, was asked to conduct the press conference. He did well and was later made Director of the then-secret National Security Agency.
We have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports that have come to us from all kinds of sources. Of this great mass of reports, we have been able adequately to explain the great bulk of them, explain them to our own satisfaction. We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberrations.
The headlines were reassuring. No menace. The CIA set up the Robertson Panel, a committee of scientists. Its report redefined the problem. What had to be taken seriously was no longer the problem of UFO sightings, but the problem of public panic.
The Robertson Panel met for a total of 12 hours. And in fact, we now know that the report's conclusions were not even written by one of the official members of the Robertson Panel. They were written by a man named Frederick Durant, who is CIA. And they were written before the panel concluded its investigation. The conclusions were written before they finished.
Internally, however, the argument still raged. In October 1952, senior military personnel even claimed that the UFOs were interplanetary ships. Strong stuff. So why were the media generally so compliant in accepting the Pentagon's official version?
It is undeniably true that the major media outlets within the United States have had a close working relationship with major U.S. intelligence organizations. This is a fact, in particular with the CIA. We know this has happened. Back in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, at the very least, we know that the CIA, for instance, cultivated at least 400 mainstream U.S. journalists without anyone's knowledge to do work on behalf of the CIA. And we're talking about people in places like CBS News, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all of the major outlets. Does this mean that the CIA controlled all of the news coming out of the U.S.? Well, no, not necessarily. But does it mean that they were able to influence the news in critical ways when they needed to? And the answer is clearly yes.
Well, I think they did do some information management. I don't deny that. I think they were concerned that if the public knew that the CIA was involved, that would panic them even further. So that they tried to limit CIA's, or at least the public's knowledge of CIA's involvement.
It went further than that. UFOs, or flying saucers, as they were now called, were given a makeover. No longer the Red Terror, they were now ridiculous, a subject for the tabloids and the illiterate. Kid stuff. But the sightings did not stop.
October 4th, 1955, there was another very interesting sighting by a United States senator traveling through the Soviet Union. And this senator was Richard Russell.
I am certain that I can carry every one of the southern and border states against General Eisenhower, and he has considerable strength in that area against almost any other Democratic candidate.
Russell was one of the most powerful men in Washington. He was chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee and had run for the Democratic nomination to challenge Eisenhower for the presidency. In 1955, Russell and two aides were traveling by train on a diplomatic mission in the Soviet Union. Unable to sleep, Russell looked out of the window.
Russell saw an object rise, apparently stop, and then take off. It looked like a flying saucer. It looked round. He was able to differentiate the various layers of this object. He called his two aides over after the object had gone, and sure enough, a second object they all saw rise and take off in similar manner to the first.
2 years later, news of the incident trickled through to the press. Questioned by journalists, Russell said he'd been asked to keep it quiet. Only in the mid-1980s did UFO researchers obtain a court clearance releasing Russell's CIA files.
He is convinced he has seen UFOs. This sets off alarm bells in the agency, as you can imagine. They went out and extensively interviewed Senator Russell to determine just what he had seen. And from those interviews, they determined that Russell had not seen a UFO or some secret weapon, but had seen traditional Soviet fighters in vertical climbs.
Now, the official CIA explanation for this was that Russell mistakenly saw Soviet aircraft engaging in an ultra-high high-angle takeoff. But if you read what he actually said in the report, it's impossible to square these two explanations, because he described clearly what was a circular craft.
So how does Russell's description match the CIA's official conclusion?
It's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it.
Now, what's disturbing about this, if you really consider the implications, is that either the Soviets had UFO sightings or they had their own UFOs, if you really want to go to the ultimate conclusion about this.
Well, of course, they were very concerned about what was going on in the Soviet Union. And what concerned them was, as the more increasing reports of UFOs came in, that they could find nothing in the Soviet press reporting UFOs. So they came, I think, to the conclusion that the Soviet government was hiding either the development of a secret plane or a secret weapon, and wouldn't allow the Soviet people to report on UFOs. So this then alarms U.S. policymakers.
Безусловно, как чудо, что вот пока кто-то еще держит меня на земле.
Meet Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya before the murder that shocked the world.
She never had doubt who tried to kill her.
Поэтому у меня, конечно, есть основания.
Скажем так, у меня больше претензий именно к заказчику.
The events that led to the death of Putin's fiercest critic.
In fact, the Soviets did try to build disc-shaped aircraft. Initially, they must have used wartime German designs, and later designs of their own. Nothing has been published about these experiments, and very little is known about them. This aircraft, built in the 1970s, is more like an airship.
Наше руководство рассматривало, что это неизученное явление, которое нужно изучать, что сделать летающую тарелку на обычных известных принципах нетрудно, можно сделать, а что те принципы, которые там заложены, предполагали, что это, по-видимому, антигравитация. И вот на антигравитацию давались большие государственные деньги. Я этим делом занимался.
Flying discs were also developed in the US and Canada.
In the United States, there were, around 1955 and 56, some media reports that came out, that leaked, regarding research into anti-gravity, into breakthroughs that were supposed to be imminent any time, and various experiments with disc-shaped airframes.
In Canada, the government and then the US Air Force funded Avro to build the Avro car. Shaped like a flying saucer, the Avro car was a complete flop. It would never rise more than 2 meters above the ground. It was actually a badly designed, unstable hovercraft. After a few test flights, both its prototypes ended up in museums. In any event, some believe that it was just a diversion to keep secret the real research project. Silverbug. Silverbug was planned capable of many times the speed of sound. Silverbug never flew. But some puzzling UFO sightings did have entirely tangible causes.
To me, an interesting part of the entire UFO story is what occurs in 1954, 55, and then into the 60s, when you have a major increase in UFO sightings. And this comes from not just ordinary people, but airline pilots and controllers and so forth that are reporting seeing UFOs at 60, 65, 70,000 feet.
These years saw the first flight tests of the U-2, a CIA spy plane that could fly many kilometers higher than any other aircraft of the time. It was top secret and was meant to stay that way.
The agency and the Air Force put together what they called Blue Book teams. And they went out and they would interview airline pilots or controllers in an attempt to explain to those folks that they hadn't really seen a UFO, but it was a natural phenomenon. For example, if you had been a United pilot flying between San Francisco and LA, and you'd reported a UFO at 60,000 feet, and we would go out and explain that what you really saw at that time of day was the sun reflecting off ice crystals, which made an image of movement across the sky, but it really wasn't an object, when in fact it was the U-2 aircraft, which was silver.
That's an absurd statement. Absolutely absurd. We're talking thousands of sightings. You're going to tell me that the U-2 aircraft can stop, maneuver, and look like a flying saucer to all of these people? It's absurd. The U-2 aircraft flies at 80,000 feet and goes as straight as a string. You cannot mistake that every single, all of these times for UFOs. A few times, sure, maybe. But in the quantity that Haynes was implying, this is ridiculous.
To the Soviets, however, the U-2 really was a UFO, an unidentified flying object. Soviet airspace was crowded with various types of US planes, balloons, and the U-2, plus sightings of flying saucers and balls of light. Soviet radar did detect the U-2, but the military would not accept its existence. The first fighter pilot who did a ballistic vertical climb and reported a U-2 UFO was not given a medal, but got into trouble, like everyone else who saw UFOs. Anyone who wanted to remain a pilot was better off citing nothing.
Приехал генерал-полковник в то время Евгений Савицкий, отец нынешней нашей депутата Государственной Думы. Приехал, побеседовал с ним и сделал такой окончательный и не подлежащий обсуждению вывод. А у него немножко так с приветом. Человек захотел отличиться, захотел получить награду. Ничего этого быть не может.
The Americans also sent spy balloons over the Soviet Union that were thought to be UFOs. But the Soviet Union's first UFO investigation was triggered by one of its own missile tests, a test so secret that not even the Commission of Inquiry was told the truth. It was maddening.
Думаю, что боялись допускать это. Я думаю, а потому что я еще раз вам говорю, вот в этом заключается причудливость, что если это допустить, то тогда надо следующее, сказал букву А, надо делать Б и так далее, весь алфавит проходить. На этом останавливались. Ну, не знаем, завтра узнаем.
UFOs and the U-2. The problem was like navigating in a hall of mirrors.
Here is a sensitive aircraft that is going to give the United States advantage in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, and to disclose it, you might lose that advantage. I think here you could understand policymakers' reluctance to release this type of information.
But wasn't everything the US military found out about UFOs, if it did find out anything, kept from the US public for the same reason? Was the US government really lying to its people with the best intentions? In 15 years at the latest, US citizens would learn that the state also lies because it has dirty secrets. Such as the MK-Ultra experiments during the 1950s. The CIA injected LSD and mescaline into unsuspecting people and studied their reactions. Why?
The simple explanation to that, of course, is the Korean War, the capture of POWs, and the belief that the Soviet Union and the communists were using mind-controlled drugs to brainwash POWs and American soldiers. This then leads to a whole series of drug experimentations in the United States with LSD and the agency and the Army.
Some of these terrible experiments were conducted on blacks because they were, quote, easier to get than guinea pigs. The CIA tried to reprogram brains and to produce schizophrenic, self-sacrificing assassins who did not know they were assassins. Electrodes were implanted in human brains, and experiments pioneered in German concentration camps were continued.
Some of the MK-Ultra experiments involved terminal sensory deprivation. In other words, horrific experiments in which someone was in a sensory deprivation environment until they died. This happened. It happened in Canada. Or people would lose their minds permanently. So these are horrific, horrific things. And so that the secrecy around them was absolutely essential, obviously.
All this was revealed only because some CIA chiefs forgot to destroy psychiatric hospital accounts with their names on them. Through the Freedom of Information Act, Americans found out about things at least as unbelievable as the UFO documents that were later published by court order. Many people distrusted CIA assurances that the intelligence agencies had lost interest in UFOs in the late 1950s. They assumed that in hundreds of cases, such as the Redmond sighting, the lies were continuing. September 1955. During a night shift in Redmond, Oregon, police officer Robert Dickerson noticed a strange light in the sky.
And right in this area, I seen it was a bright light. It was coming down. I thought it was something going to hit the ground. I didn't know what it was, you know. The object was longer than it was high, you know, something like a football. And it was bright. You could see, looked like heat waves coming off it. There was kind of, you know, some different, it would change colors a little bit.
Dickerson drove to the airport, where flight services specialist Laverne Wirtz was on duty.
I was looking at it mostly, I think, from like a side view. If you took like two saucers and put them concave like this and leave just a little space around it, that would be about the form that you would have. And I remember the lights kind of being on the rim, like on the rim of it, and it would change color there from like orange to kind of a yellow, and then, like Bob had mentioned, real bright, like kind of like an arc, and you could see the waves, kind of heat waves from it.
The object was also sighted by a radar station, which alerted the Air Force.
Within a few minutes, several jet fighters were dispatched, 6 in total.
Radar led the fighters to the target. Then they saw it themselves on their screens in the cockpit.
It was shortly after that that they contacted me on the military frequency on the console, and I talked to what I would assume was the lead pilot.
At least 2 pilots saw the UFO. In the first light of dawn, they flew towards it.
They made an approach to it, and I know at least 2 of the jets did, and I know at least one of them had to take evasive action so they wouldn't be on collision course. And I remember another one stating that we call it vortex. It's the displacement of the air by something that made him almost lose control, and he had to take corrective action in his jet to recover.
The UFO ascended at great speed, but remained visible on the radar screens for a while longer. Then it left the range of the air traffic controllers at a height of over 15,000 meters.
The official Air Force explanation, the first one, was that pilots had been scrambled to investigate what turned out to be false radar returns. And that's all. Now, this was a problem because reports had immediately come out locally of the airport officials in checking for radiation. So the question arises, well, why would they be checking for radiation at the scene when it was supposedly false radar returns?
The next explanation was that Wirtz and Dickerson had seen a weather balloon.
They come up with, first of all, it was a weather balloon, and I'm sure everybody here is familiar with weather balloons. You know, they go up with helium, and they go with the wind. You know, they don't ascend, descend, they don't move sideways.
Furious, an unknown superior of Laverne Wirtz at the Federal Aviation Authority sent all the records of the incident to a UFO group.
Faced with that explanation, the Air Force reprimanded the FAA for supposedly issuing false information, and then said, well, no, actually what they all saw was simply the planet Venus.
The Air Force was kind of trying to downplay this and make us look just a little bit stupid, that we were incompetent and really didn't know what we were doing.
The case made headlines only in the regional press. UFOs were no longer a topic for serious journalists. In Washington, the security apparatus kept on working systematically to remove UFOs from the spotlight. It was now a matter of officially ending all official investigation activity. This is why the government-funded Condon Report on UFOs was commissioned in the 1960s.
Das Forschungsziel war, zu sagen, dass das meiste sich aufklären ließe, ja vielleicht auch sogar alles. Und Condon ist ja so weit gegangen, zu sagen, dass es für die Wissenschaft überhaupt nichts bringt und das sollte man aufgeben.
According to the media, science too had now relegated UFOs to the lunatic fringe.
Das ist ja so ein dicker Wälzer von 1000 Seiten und man kann viel Interessantes daraus entnehmen und auch, dass es unidentifizierbare Flugobjekte gibt. Aber im Vorwort steht das Gegenteil. Also das ist also ein Treppenwitz in der Wissenschaft.
Mission accomplished. As far as the serious public is concerned, the subject of UFOs has been dead since the 1960s. There is no consensus on whether the military and secret services are still investigating them. They are now the private interest of a few stalwarts like Klaas Svahn, who collects reports and, together with like-minded people, has built up an archive in Sweden. His sound work has earned him a good reputation in Scandinavia, even with the Swedish military. Once a month, he meets with the officer responsible for UFOs at the Research Institute of National Defense, calmly, in the Swedish way.
I think Mr. Swan has quite the same view as I, a rather scientific view on this thing, that probably 99% of all sightings could be explained scientifically. And there is a small proportion which are really a mystery.
There is probably a simple explanation for this previously unreleased Swedish video. So far, however, it has puzzled every expert consulted since 1997. Hessdalen in Norway. There have been so many UFO sightings here that private researchers have set up an automatic station. It has already provided a few images, and it has shown that extremely strong electromagnetic fields are associated with the phenomenon of floating lights. Officially, the intelligence agencies and the military have had no interest in UFOs for decades. But is that really true? In the 1990s, stubborn ufologists forced the publication of a bizarre report of the air battle of an Iranian jet with a UFO over Tehran in 1976. Through an oversight, the distribution list of the report was also published. It included Henry Kissinger, the CIA, NSA, the Air Force Chief of Staff, and the White House. There have been 3,400 UFO sightings by civilian and military pilots alone.
Wenn wir die Fakten über die Beobachtungen kennen und kennen auch die Meinung irgendwelcher offizieller Sprecher in den USA, dass das nicht stimmen kann, was sie sagen. Wir haben bloß die Möglichkeit, entweder lügen sie oder sie wissen es nicht. Entweder sind sie zu dumm oder sie belügen die Bevölkerung. Dazwischen kann man wählen.
Es geht nicht mehr nur um UFOs, es geht darum, dass die Machtzentren die Bevölkerung manipulieren wie Marionetten, dass sie in manchen Dingen einfach desinformiert werden, man kann sagen belogen werden.
Napoleon Bonaparte made the perceptive quote many years ago that authoritarian governments have the luxury of silence. A democratic government has no such luxury, therefore it has to lie again and again. And this has been the case within the United States through the 1940s and 50s, when it did lie repeatedly about the nature of UFOs. What one finds today, frankly, in the 21st century, is that the United States government is indeed silent on UFOs.
In the United States, some scientists think UFOs are an interesting research subject, but no one expects government assistance in the search for the truth.